The witch was also the rebel woman who talked back, argued, swore, and did not cry under torture.
In this video, we are going to do a bit of a dive into capitalism and witchcraft, and how I have more and more reasons to believe that one is the opposite of the other. It's basically an answer to the video that I've done in November, where I was like, I have questions about the election. Can you help me understand? Well, I think I've understood. We're going to look into the reasons why it might seem that legislation-wise, with 45 getting back into power, it seems like we're going backwards. We're going to look into the reasons why, realistically, capitalism needs slavery to continue. No, not in the 1600s, now. We're going to look into the ways in which capitalism enabled and sprouted patriarchy and uses patriarchy to uphold itself, but also turns against it when needed. And we're going to look into one of the main points of contention, which, along with the attack on marginalized identities, it's reproductive rights and the cycle of fear that elections and parties, especially in America, are based upon. We're going to look more into detail onto the war on minorities and the actual examples that happened when those promises of fear-mongering are actually seen through. Looking at you, Ron DeSantis. And we're going to try and draw conclusions from them and see, as individuals, as people, what can we actually do? It's a Sunday. And I was woken up this Sunday by a message by my very dear friend, Sofia, showing me the first page of an Italian newspaper talking about how now that Trump has been elected, and I think he's going to be sworn in on the 18th of January, Meta is already going back onto their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And unfortunately, I had to be the one telling her, oh, yeah, I'm not surprised. That was part of Project 2025. And I found myself in the unfortunate position of having to explain to someone what Project 2025 was.
You might have heard about Project 2025. It's the handmaiden-esque conservative plan to reshape the federal government under the next presidential administration. It was created by the conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, and has deep connections to the Trump administration. But of course, it's so sweeping and draconian that even Donald Trump has had to try to attempt to distance himself from it.
And this started a discussion in my head with my spouse, and immediately I was also reminded that last night they showed me the proposal of a new law that is going to come in discussing reproductive rights, and how suddenly abortion rights are not going to be about the decision of a woman or her body, but also will have to consider her spiritual needs, as well as the needs of her husband. Again, this comes exactly from Project 2025, and it was said everywhere that it was fear-mongering. Trump himself tried to distance himself, saying, no, they're fundamentalists. But there were very obvious video clips, actually, of people behind Heritage Foundation, which wrote Project 2025, saying very openly, oh, no, he's doing that completely fine. It's part of his PR. It's how he needs to distance himself so that actually, once he gets in power, he can enact what we do and what we say.
Up with this, I don't know what the hell it is. It's Project 25.
Are you ready? I know nothing about Project 25. I haven't seen the document. I don't intend to really see the document.
But behind closed doors, Vote tells us not to take Trump's disavowal seriously.
I expect you to hear 10 more times from the rally, the president, distancing himself from the left's boogeyman at Project 2025.
Yeah. And you're not worried about that?
I'm not worried about it.
Okay.
He's running against a brand. He is not running against any people.
Okay.
He is not running against any institutions. It's interesting. He's in fact not even opposing himself to a particular policy. Yeah. He's been at our organization. He's raised money for our organization. He's blessed it from the, I remember walking into our last day in office and told him what I was going to do. So he's very supportive of what we do.
So yeah, while 45 was talking about annexing Canada, buying Greenland, this was actually the blueprint of what is expected of the conservative presidency, I think in the first 6 months, and this is not the first time that this happens. If you want more detailed information about Project 2025 and how problematic it is and how it's not the first time that this happens, there are beautiful videos by Second Thought and Dasia Said that I will link directly down in the description below for you to have more of an idea about it. This video is not going to be that much on Project 2025, but it is important because we literally, unfortunately, have the blueprint of what's going to happen, not even in the next 4 years, but I worry, in the immediate present. So January rolled in, and 45 is about to be sworn in again, and Meta suddenly decided that, you know what we're going to do? We're going to roll back fact-checking, we're going to roll back on our diversity, equity, and inclusion, we are going to move our offices to Texas because their laws are so liberal, aren't they? And we're going to allow hate speech again. So when you say that an LGBT person has mental health issues, it's completely fine. You should say that, actually. Why did we get rid of conversion therapy in the first place? This is where we are. This is not fear-mongering. This is what has happened, which is part of the reason why there's an exodus from Meta. I invite you to join me. You find me on Blue Sky and on Tumblr because of that. So after waking up to having to explain Project 2025 and remembering that last night my spouse showed me this House resolution about reproductive rights, or lack thereof, that they plan on having, I was suddenly made aware that there needs to be reflection. Why? How are we going backwards? How can progress go backwards? How are hard-fought rights being rolled back? And then I was reminded by looking literally just at the Wikipedia of Roe v. Wade, because that's where my mind went. If we are trying to go back on reproductive rights, we're going back again to see why Roe v. Wade was overturned in the last couple of years, and now it's gonna be properly embedded into law. So a House resolution going even harder than simply the overthrow of Roe v. Wade is basically testing the water to see what is the consensus so that then we can push forward the bill. So curiously, whereas Roe v. Wade is something from the 70s that was never enshrined in law, but always just used as a precedent, and therefore could eventually be overturned. This is the first step in proposing a bill that will be enshrined in law that basically says,
recognizing the importance of access to comprehensive, high-quality, life-affirming medical care for women of all ages, whereas healthcare for women should emphasize the whole woman, including her physical, mental, and spiritual wellness, whereas healthcare for women should also address the needs of men, families, and communities as they relate to women's healthcare.
Going to the page of Roe versus Wade and understanding what was the historical context for that.
Roe v. Wade was a landmark decision of the US Supreme Court in which the court ruled that the Constitution of the United States protected a right to have an abortion. The decision struck down many abortion laws, and it sparked an ongoing abortion debate in the United States about whether, or to what extent, abortion should be legal, who should decide the legality of abortion, and what the role of moral and religious views in the political sphere should be. The case was brought by Norma McGorvey under the legal pseudonym Jane Roe, who in 1969 became pregnant with her third child. McGorvey wanted an abortion but lived in Texas, where abortion was illegal except when necessary to save the mother's life. Her lawyers, Sarah Weddington and Linda Coffey, filed a lawsuit on her behalf in US federal court against her local district attorney, Henry Wade, alleging that Texas abortion laws were unconstitutional. A special three-judge court of the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Texas heard the case and ruled in her favour. In January 1973, the Supreme Court issued a 7-2 decision in McGorvey's favour, holding that the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution provides a fundamental right to privacy, which protects a pregnant woman's right to an abortion. It also held that the right to abortion is not absolute and must be balanced against the government's interests in protecting women's health and prenatal life. It resolves these competing interests by announcing a pregnancy trimester timetable to govern all abortion regulations in the United States. In 2022, the Supreme Court overruled Roe in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization on the grounds that the substantive right to abortion was not deeply rooted in the nation's history or tradition, nor considered a right when the Due Process Clause was ratified in 1868 and was unknown in US law until Roe.
Something caught my eye and started to make me draw parallels and connections. And the point was that at the time, the main thing that was happening, so late 60s, early 70s, was still that, guess what? Because access to abortion wasn't straightforward at all, a lot of women were still dying for badly performed abortion. There's a throwaway line in the Wikipedia of Roe v. Wade that
after the 1840s, there was an upsurge in abortions. In the 19th century, the medical profession was generally opposed to abortion, which arose due to competition between men with medical degrees and women without one. The practice of abortion was one of the first medical specialties and was practiced by unlicensed people. Well-off people had abortions and paid well.
That talks about the sort of opposition of different camps that there was between school-educated male doctors and practice-educated women midwives, meaning that men went to school for OBGYNs, women didn't necessarily go to school, but guess what? Having that kind of access and bodies themselves, they had an understanding of how to perform abortion for other people. And that is something that I have recently heard in a lecture about feminism and witchcraft by Dr. Tabitha Stanholm, and also in my most recent read, which is Caliban and the Witch. It's a throwaway line, so it doesn't make you think much if you don't put it in that context. In that context, one starts to understand the way in which, as the title of this video says, witchcraft tends to be the opposite of capitalism. Why is that? Since the Middle Ages, one of the professions that were more apt for women that, as you might guess from the word profession, weren't necessarily just relegated to the life of family, was indeed midwifery.
By the 14th century, women were also becoming school teachers as well as doctors and surgeons, and were beginning to compete with university-trained men, gaining at times a high reputation. 16 female doctors, among them several Jewish women specialized in surgery or eye therapy, were hired in the 14th century by the municipality of Frankfurt, which, like other city administrations, offered its population a system of public health care. Female doctors, as well as midwives or sage femmes, were dominant in obstetrics, either in the pay of city governments or supporting themselves with the compensation they received from their patients. After the cesarean cut was introduced in the 13th century, female obstetrics were the only ones who practiced it.
It wasn't common, but women could even study midwifery. Until arguably the Black Death and the decimation of population in Europe, abortion and ways to take care of a pregnancy for a woman were quite common knowledge, the kind of herbs that you would need, the kind of ways in which you would do things. And it was knowledge passed between the women communities.
Things changed drastically. As soon as women's control over reproduction seemed to pose a threat to economic and social stability, as it did in the aftermath of the demographic catastrophe produced by the Black Death, the apocalyptic plague that between 1347 and 1352 destroyed more than 1/3 of the European population. Corresponding to this process, which marked the transition from the persecution of heresy to witch hunting, the figure of the heretic increasingly became that of a woman, so that, by the beginning of the 15th century, the main target of persecution against heretics became the witch.
It started to be regulated against, likely because the way in which the Black Death, the plague, affected population numbers in Europe started to affect the number of workers that were available. At the time, we were also at a crucial moment in time from the evolution from feudalism to capitalism. And the passage is a simple slavery, really. We'll get into how wage work was considered slavery, actually, in a moment. But suffice to say, for the topic at hand of women in medical positions, their specialty was indeed midwifery, and therefore anything that had to do with female reproductive health. And that, again, was a knowledge passed through generation between communities of women. There is, however, an interesting opposition that starts to come with the Enlightenment of educated, studied, gone to university men that become doctors, opposed, therefore, to these women that are based entirely on their experience being midwives.
In France and England, starting from the end of the 16th century, few women were allowed to practice obstetrics, an activity that, until that time, had been their inviolable mystery. Then, by the beginning of the 17th century, the first male midwives began to appear, and within a century, obstetrics has come almost entirely under state control. According to Alice Clark, the continuous process by which women were supplanted by men in the profession is one example of the way in which they are excluded from all branches of professional work through being denied the opportunity of obtaining an adequate professional training.
And they started to oppose the concept of the educated male doctor and the rudimentary ways in which these self-taught women, in a way, were leading midwifery, basically pushing them away from delivery rooms and all the things that happened before that, very easily conflating them with witches as well.
We also know that many witches were midwives or wise women, traditionally the depository of women's reproductive knowledge and control. The Malleus dedicated an entire chapter to them, arguing that they were worse than any other woman, since they helped the mother destroy the fruit of her womb, a conspiracy made easier, they charged, by the exclusion of men from the rooms where women gave birth. The authors recommended that no woman should be allowed to practice this art unless she first demonstrated to have been a good Catholic. The suspicion under which midwives came in this period, leading to the entrance of the male doctor into the delivery room, stemmed more from the authorities' fears of infanticide than from any concern with the midwife's alleged medical incompetence. With the marginalization of the midwife, the process began by which women lost the control they had exercised over procreation and were reduced to a passive role in child delivery, while male doctors came to be seen as the true givers of life. With this shift, a new medical practice also prevailed, one that, in the case of a medical emergency, prioritized the life of the fetus over that of the mother.
In the Malleus Maleficarum, there is a lot of hatred for midwives because they are considered dangerous women that are around unbaptized babies. And so there's this supporting of the ideas of getting them out of delivery rooms and getting these educated male doctors there instead. Something that is worth mentioning here is that I am not questioning the fact that education and technology and science allowed us to make leaps and bounds forward, and we have antibiotics now, and we have computers. However, education has been historically an institution or held by institutions that have an interest in conveying a certain kind of information packaged so that, as you might have heard, history is told by the winners, which is the reason why male doctors were managing to put into textbooks that then nowadays even female doctors study upon concepts like hysteria, the wandering womb, the idea that, you know what, black women actually are more tough-skinned, so they should receive less anesthetic. You know what, also, I don't think that a cervix biopsy is going to hurt that much. And I'm just going to tell you that you're going to feel a pinch, despite the fact that I'm literally taking a piece of tissue from inside your body. True story, I've been told that by 2 female medical practitioners that genuinely were surprised that I was crying, screaming, and bleeding. It is basically how we introduced, on an institutional level through education, medical misogyny and racism. Even placing being transgender amongst the mental issues rather than endocrinological issues is a way to take away agency from the people that we have decided have just something that doesn't work quite right or as right as in the mind of, you guessed it, male doctors. Blanchard, I'm looking at you. You would think that this might explain the internalized misogyny in a lot of women that do uphold all these values. And that also made me think of something like going back to the Heritage Foundation and who they are and why do they use the talking points that they use to basically draw back rights for everyone except for white, cis, het, able, rich is important, capitalistic men. And why are they ready to use everything in their power and even things that you wouldn't think are necessarily that connected to it? Because the Heritage Foundation presents itself as Christian fundamentalists, basically. It started to make me think on the fact that the people at the head of this kind of organizations don't have a particular care for principles, but they have a very clear idea of where they want to get to. And in that pathway, they will use anything that is useful to them. The example that came to mind was 45 presenting himself as this Christian fundamentalist himself, holding the Bible, and when asked about his favorite passage on the Bible, just saying, it's too private, I can say.
I'm wondering what one or two of your most favored Bible verses are and why.
I wouldn't want to get into it because to me that's very personal. You know, when I talk about the Bible, it's very personal, so I don't want to get into verses.
This is not a Christian person. They don't even know what they're talking about in the sense of Christianity, but they know that the talking points and principles of Christianity can very easily be co-opted for what they need in the end. And what they need in the end is a nuclear family, because the nuclear family is the fundamental cornerstone of capitalism. But we'll get there in due time, because it's not the next chapter, simply because the next chapter is Capitalism and Slavery. Before getting into how capitalism enables patriarchy for the nuclear family to exist, we need to go on another fundamental cornerstone of capitalism, which is slavery.
Primitive accumulation consisted in an immense accumulation of labor power, that labor in the form of stolen goods and living labor in the form of human beings made available for exploitation, realized on a scale never before matched in the course of history. Significantly, the tendency of the capitalist class during the first 3 centuries of its existence was to impose slavery and other forms of coerced labor as the dominant work relation, a tendency limited only by the workers' resistance and the danger of the exhaustion of the workforce. It is now established that the plantation system fueled the Industrial Revolution, as argued by Eric Williams, who noted that hardly a brick in Liverpool and Bristol was not cemented with African blood.
This must be stressed, as it helps us realize how essential slavery has been for the history of capitalism, and why, periodically, but systematically, whenever the capitalist system is threatened by a major economic crisis, the capitalist class has to launch a process of primitive accumulation, that is, a process of large-scale colonization and enslavement. With its immense concentration of workers and its captive labor force uprooted from its homeland, unable to rely on local support, the plantation prefigured not only the factory, but also the later use of immigration and globalization to cut the cost of labor while keeping enslaved and waged workers geographically and socially divided.
In Caliban and the Witch, it is discussed how the primitive accumulation that was necessary for capitalism to take off needed to steal stuff from somewhere for nothing, and the labor and workforce of all the generations of African people kidnapped and taken to the Americas to be used as free labor on plantations is part of what this primitive accumulation was. So it was the accumulation not only of wealth in terms of dead labor, so objects, the value, the sugar, but also of live labor, which is literally the people that were working and making things for nothing. There is the very wrong perception that slavery was a one-off, and when we started to disassemble that system in the 1800s, that's it. Now capitalism goes and keeps on because it's the natural way of things that we would naturally go towards. It's really not. And here I'm going to show you historical facts as to why. Capitalism needs slavery currently. That is the reason why, as we looked into capitalism and cottagecore,
the complete irony of the current situation is that the system was designed for Shane to do this. Corporations have been destroying the competition of small business by outsourcing manufacturing to countries with cheap labor, allowing them to undercut prices and maximize profits, replacing opportunities for skilled laborers to make a real living with low-paid, unskilled service or warehouse jobs. All Shane is doing is cutting out the middleman. Instead of selling their goods to big brands for them to mark up the price and make more profits, they're selling them directly to the customers and making the profits themselves. This is what companies are supposed to do under capitalism.
We started off with neoliberalism in the 60s and 70s because suddenly paying fair wages to people was taking capital and wealth away from the 1%. Second Thought, in their video about the Heritage Foundation, literally goes into historical points of this. The entire reason for the Heritage Foundation to exist as a think tank was that the millionaires, the 1%, were kind of bothered that with this thing about fair wages, they were getting less profits, which is very ridiculous because to me is the idea of, oh, I have this mountain of money, but I need the mountain to be bigger. It's just such a different way of thinking of life and existence that I genuinely cannot grasp. The hoarding. But the point was the number wasn't going up fast enough, and therefore the billionaires, well, the millionaires at the time, needed a think tank that was not as impartial as the think tanks that were around already, but needed to specifically work towards the interest of capital. Isn't it peculiar that a think tank that declares itself mainly about principle of Christianity is so dedicated to capital? Oh, absolutely not. Because as we mentioned about slavery, there always will need to be people that are used and abused and taken advantage of. This didn't end in the 1800s. To take advantage of humans that way, you need a process of, you guessed it, dehumanization. And the way you do that is with a us versus them mentality, and dehumanizing them is very convenient when you have an entire book called the Bible that you can extrapolate from without much necessary context to it, to just decide all these people really are less valuable than us. So the things that we're going to do to them are not going to be as bad as if we do them to real humans. Don't forget that African people brought to the Americas were considered chattel. The way that we are dehumanizing LGBTQ people nowadays, equating the existence of being a queer person to pornography, is trying to do exactly the same thing.
Alabama Republicans filed legislation that would prohibit drag performances in public places where children are present. The measure would serve as an amendment to the state's Anti-Obscenity Enforcement Act, which prohibits the distribution of obscene material to minors.
And when you take rights and protections away from people, you are basically pushing them into a corner where they will have less and less choices about the things that they will need to do in order to still survive in capitalism. Keep people threatened that way, and they will keep their head down, doing the little that they can to survive. If they are busy then working for their wage and keeping their head down and not showing off too much their lifestyle, you don't have to worry about revolution, or so they think. Also, let's not forget, Amendment 13, which is the amendment that banned slavery in America, made an exception for prisoners. And what is the largest demographic of prisoners in the US?
Research indicates that there is extensive racial and ethnic discrimination by police and the judicial system. A substantial academic literature has compared police searches, showing that contraband is found at high rates in whites who are stopped, bail decisions, showing that whites with the same bail decision as blacks commit more pretrial violations, and sentencing, showing that blacks are more harshly sentenced by juries and judges than whites when the underlying facts and circumstances of the cases are similar, providing valid causal inferences of racial discrimination. Studies have documented patterns of racial discrimination as well as patterns of police brutality and disregard for the constitutional rights of African Americans by police departments in various American cities.
Black people, it's black people. We're just continuing slavery through this dancing through hoops.
Africa, historically, sub-Saharan Africa, has been fundamental to the global prosperity of the advanced countries. Okay? And Africa had a role to play. It has a role as a raw material producer. We will not allow sub-Saharan Africa to escape that. Okay, we do everything to keep sub-Saharan Africa where it is, also impoverished. It's absolutely vital for the prosperity of everyone else. So let's get clear about that. Okay, and this means all the economic structures, all the global institutions, and the economics we teach everyone is all designed to keep Africa exactly where it is.
You would think that I am being exaggerated. Does it really count as slavery? Without necessarily going into the sweatshops, but again, I will send you to Capitalism and Cottagecore to understand how to have fast fashion like Shein. Yes, the people working for that are slaves. They are treated the same way. There is also this concept of slavery and how it arrived to us that I think has really been exaggerated for the purpose of make us believe that it doesn't exist anymore. That's not the case, and it wasn't the case historically. I wish I could go in detail into Caliban and the Witch. If you take a read of that, you will understand this better in very, very short. Without saying that feudalism was necessarily better, because the concept of feudalism was you have serfs that work the land for the landlord. They don't necessarily own that piece of land, but they sort of have a lease on it, and the catch is that they work the land to make products from themselves, to sustain themselves, and they also have to make the products for the landlord to sustain himself because he doesn't want to fucking work. Ironic, right? I know, like landlords today. Nothing has changed in that. But the point at the time was that the economy was not for profit, was production for consumption. What you planted in the fields was feeding you, was feeding the rest of the village with exchanges of different goods. If I was the one in the village that was making the bread for everyone, somebody else was cultivating the vegetables. Somebody else was making amazing crochet sweaters that I would cover myself. Despite the fact that historically we hear about money and coins being something that has always existed, it is half true in the sense that in these communities there wasn't necessarily an equation with money because you would still exchange goods between one another. And there was also this thing about the common land. The common land was the land of everyone. It wasn't necessarily a property of the landlord. And the village would use it in a communal way. So people would plant different things. And this idea of, oh, but if you plant fruit trees, everybody will have access to that. Yeah, that was kind of the point. That's where the community would come together because it was in the communal interest. Everybody was very respectful of the communal land. Silvia Federici argues that the beginning of capitalism came with the enclosures that suddenly made the public common land into private land.
In England, land privatization was mostly accomplished through the enclosures, a phenomenon that has become so associated with the expropriation of workers from their common wealth that in our time it is used by anti-capitalist activists as a signifier for every attack on social entitlements. In the 16th century, enclosure was a technical term indicating a set of strategies the English lords and rich farmers used to eliminate communal land property and expand their holdings. It is mostly referred to the abolition of the open field system, an arrangement by which villagers owned non-contiguous strips of land in a non-hedged field. Enclosing also included the fencing off of the commons and the pulling down of the shacks of poor cottagers who had no land but could survive because they had access to customary rights. Large tracts of land were also enclosed to create deer parks, while entire villages were cast down to be laid to pasture.
It was also very important to make a distinction here because I know that people that don't know about socialism will go, oh, why do you want people to just come and take your things? Private property, personal property, two different things.
It is important to distinguish personal possessions, your clothes, bicycle, your home, if you own it, from capital. Capital is a particular form of private property, including factories, mines, transport, and energy utilities, shops, offices, and increasingly, financial capital that enables its owners to make profit from the work of others and to accumulate yet more capital and power. property that is private gives the owner the right to exclude others from its use. It existed well before capitalism, certainly way back to the invention of agriculture, although anthropologists tell us that some supposedly primitive people today believe that objects are possessed only while they're being used. Otherwise, they are held in common.
Nobody's arguing about people ever coming to get your wardrobe, your shoes, your tools, but it was about the common shared goods that suddenly became the goods of just one, guess who? The landlord, and suddenly you had to pay him for the privilege of using the land, using these tools that were a way in which you made stuff for the community, exchange it, and everybody was in these communities that were self-sustaining. Not that I am arguing for feudalism, but the common life was a loss that we have never recovered from. In modern terms, this still means that the 0.4% in the UK own, get ready for it, 47% of the land. 0.4 47. And that was the land that was stolen and enclosed from privative accumulation to go towards capitalism. Before, this land was the land of the people that was worked together, and these villages were self-sustaining. Can you begin to imagine that? I vaguely can, because my farmer's village, even in the 1900s, still had a lot of those elements, which is really bizarre to think. But with the expropriation of the common land from the farmers, and especially with the commutation, which was basically this.
The most important resolution of the master-serf conflict was the commutation of labor services with money payments, money rents, money taxes, that placed the feudal relation on a more contractual basis. To the well-to-do peasants, who possessing large tracts of land could earn enough money to buy their blood and employ other laborers, commutation must have appeared as a great step on the road to economic and personal independence, for the lords lessened their control over their tenants when they no longer depended directly on their work. But the majority of poorer peasants, who possessed only a few acres of land barely sufficient for their survival, lost even the little they had. Compelled to pay their dues in money, they went into chronic debt, borrowing against future harvests, a process that eventually caused many to lose their land. As a result, by the 13th century, when commutation spread throughout Western Europe, social divisions in the rural areas deepened, and part of the peasantry underwent a process of proletarianization.
A family of serfs or farmers would have their harvest, and they would own a 10% to the landlord just because he owns the land. When what you owe to the landlord is a percentage of what you produce, you have to take it away from yourself, but you can give it. When there was the commutation, there was literally the commutation of the value of the harvest into money, which, as you can imagine, this kind of equivalence can go south very quickly. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of farmers and smallholders suddenly didn't have the means to pay that tax to the landlord anymore, because their harvest would not, on a number of years, sustain it. There's a beautiful bit that is actually quoted in Caliban and the Witch that I'll put here.
As soon as moneylending became a lucrative business, this activity, previously declared unworthy of a Christian, was rehabilitated, as shown by this dialogue between a peasant and a wealthy burgher, written anonymously in Germany around 1521.
You want to know who gave me my money? I shall tell you. A peasant comes knocking at my door and asks me to lend him 10 or 20 gulden. I inquire of him whether he owns a plot of good pasture land or a nice field for plowing. He says, Yes, Berger, I have a good meadow and a fine field, worth 100 gulden the two of them. I reply, Excellent, pledge your meadow and your field as collateral, and if you will undertake to pay 1 gulden a year as interest, you can have your loan of 20 gulden. Happy to hear the good news, the peasant replies, I gladly give you my pledge. But I must tell you, I rejoin, that if ever you fail to pay your interest on time, I will take possession of your land and make it my property. And this does not worry the peasant. He proceeds to assign his pasture and field to me as his pledge. I lend him the money, and he pays interest punctually for 1 year or 2. Then comes a bad harvest, and soon he is behind in his payment. I confiscate his land, evict him, and meadow and field are mine.
About loan sharks in those times, knowing that it will be so easy for them to snatch land because farmers count on the weather. Harvest can go wrong. If you have a commutation in money, it can work on a year, 2-year basis. On the 3rd year, you have a bad harvest, suddenly you lose your land because of it. And that is what happened. That is what brought people to suddenly not have their land, not have their farm, have to sell their labor for a wage in the hope to be able to sustain themselves. The move on to waged labor compared to you own your land, you work your land, you pay a certain amount of that to the landlord, but you have this system that works, that is based on the community of the village, really. When that was broken down, bringing into wage labor, you can already start to guess how that was a move from the community to individualism, because at that point was like, well, you sell your own labor, your own, literally 2 arms, and whatever you do, you get paid for, according to the rules that, guess what, were made by the courts, made out of landlords. There was a lot of resistance to this. A lot. For a long time. We're talking hundreds of years of resistance. Waged labor was considered slavery.
With land expropriation came a change in the workers' attitude towards the wage. While in the Middle Ages, wages could be viewed as an instrument of freedom, in contrast to the compulsion of the labor services, as soon as access to land came to an end, wages began to be viewed as instruments of enslavement.
This explains the growth in the wake of the enclosures, using the term in a broad sense to include all forms of land privatisation, of the number of vagabonds and masterless men who preferred to take to the road and to risk enslavement or death, as prescribed by the bloody legislation passed against them, rather than to work for a wage.
To the point that people preferred to become vagabonds and preferring to live out of begging rather than sell their soul and their body to the waged labor, which, by the way, is the reason why the capital started to use talking points that come from religion, like Protestantism, to push forward the idea of labor makes you a virtuous person.
Colonial America relied on the labor of enslaved people and indentured servants. It was very important to the colony's wealthy and enslaving class that they find a way to motivate enslaved people to work hard, despite the fact that enslaved people had nothing to gain from it. One powerful way to do so was through religious teachings and indoctrination. A productivity-obsessed form of Christianity evolved from the older, more puritanical idea that work improved moral character, and it was pushed on enslaved people. This form of Christianity taught that suffering was morally righteous, and that slaves would be rewarded in heaven for being docile, agreeable, and most important, diligent. On the flip side, if an enslaved person was slothful or lazy, there was something fundamentally corrupt and wrong with them. Enslavers made it a point to keep enslaved people as busy and exhausted as possible, out of fear that idle time would give them the means to revolt or riot. Even more disturbing, enslaved people who tried to run away from bondage were seen as mentally ill and suffering from runaway slave disorder. By not accepting their proper role in society, they were demonstrating that they were broken and disturbed. This worldview became the foundation for American capitalism.
Which brings me back to why do the Heritage Foundation consider themselves Christian when really what they serve is the capital? For the same reason. They see that the principles of Christianity can uphold systems that, at the end of the day, support what they want from the world. And what they want from the world is to exploit the working class, to pay lower and lower wages, to make everything for profit, and to have you say thank to them because you have a job where you get overworked and enslaved. The resistance to capitalism was amazing done. There's also a point that a lot of movements that were against this move towards the wage and capitalism were actually suppressed with the help of the Catholic Church in the form of the Inquisition, because
the Church used the charge of heresy to attack every form of social and political insubordination. In 1377, when the cloth workers in Wipes, Flanders, took arms against their employers, they were not only hanged as rebels, but were burned by the Inquisition as heretics. Heresy was as much a critique of social hierarchies and economic exploitation as it was a denunciation of clerical corruption. The rejection of all forms of authority and a strong anti-commercial sentiment were common elements among the sects. Many heretics shared the ideal of apostolic poverty. Some heretic sects experimented with communism, like the early Taborites in Bohemia, for whom the establishment of equality and communal ownership were as important as religious reform.
If you decided, especially at the time when the Catholic Church had become severely corrupted and started to sell indulgences, you wanted to go into heaven, you would pay enough money to the church and you would buy your place there. Yeah, when it became that commercialized, people started to see, I don't think that this is what it's in the gospel and in the scriptures. If you dared saying that, hey, welcome to the club, you are an heretic. All the heretic movements that have been suppressed actually were pretty religious and believed in God and believed in Jesus. They just decided that the way that the church as an institution had evolved was very much after wealth and therefore capitalism. And they were just like, I don't think that this is what is in the scriptures. How dare you, heretic? That's what happened. By the way, because of the incredible religious tolerance of the Cathars that were very friendly to Jewish people at a time where in Europe they weren't even allowed, like in the UK, the encounter of these two cultures is what brought us the mysticism of the Kabbalah today. You're welcome.
The most influential among the heretical sects, the Cathars, also stand out as unique in the history of European social movements because of their abhorrence for war, including the Crusades, their condemnation of capital punishment, which provoked the Church's first explicit pronouncement in support of the death penalty, and their tolerance for other religions.
Southern France, their stronghold, was a safe haven for Jews when anti-Semitism in Europe was mounting. A fusion of Cathar and Jewish thought produced the Kabbalah, the tradition of Jewish mysticism.
True story. They were all at some point extirpated through the Inquisition, starved, killed, but it's beautiful to discover that this resistance lasted for a very, very long time. Waged labor was slavery, and it was recognized like that everywhere. Things started to change with Henry VIII because suddenly an heretic movement became established. What do we use of that? Oh, Puritanism seems interesting because of all the principles of hard work, and don't worry if you don't have a return in this life. There's the next, and that's how we started to use religion as an excuse to justify the abuse of capitalism. Keep your head down. In pursuit of social discipline, an attack was launched against all forms of collective sociality and sexuality, including sports, games, dances, ale wakes, festivals, and other group rituals that had been a source of bonding and solidarity among workers. It was sanctioned by a deluge of bills. A campaign against popular culture where what was at stake was the desocialization or decollectivization of the reproduction of the workforce, as well as the attempt to impose a more productive use of leisure time. This process, in England, reached its climax with the coming to power of the Puritans in the aftermath of the Civil War, 1642-49, when the fear of social indiscipline prompted the banning of all proletarian gatherings and merrymaking. Follow the instructions of those that are higher than you and therefore better because they're closer to God, and be grateful for what you're given, and then you'll get your reward in the next life or whatever. I don't have to worry about it in the life that I have to accumulate wealth in. That's the important thing. As you can imagine, because especially over the 200 years of resistance, people didn't give in to capitalism that easily. And don't worry, there was a lot of attempts of actually legislated things to try and sweeten the pill. There was an amazing evolution historically about first governments decided, you know what, men are angry because we are using them, abusing them. You know what we will do? We will make prostitution legal in government-run brothels so that the men can take their anger out on prostitutes.
Efforts were made by the political authorities to co-opt the youngest and most rebellious male workers by means of a vicious sexual politics that gave them access to free sex and turned class antagonism into an antagonism against proletarian women. In France, the municipal authorities practically decriminalized rape, provided the victims were women of the lower class. On average, half of the town male youth at some point engaged in these assaults, which was described as a form of class protest, a means for proletarian men who were forced to postpone marriage for many years because of their economic conditions to get back their own and take revenge against the rich. But the results were destructive for all workers, as a state-backed raping of poor women undermined the class solidarity that had been achieved in the anti-feudal struggle. State-managed prostitution was seen as a useful remedy for the turbulence of proletarian youth. Was officially recognized as a public service. Even the church came to see prostitution as a legitimate activity. The state-managed brothel was believed to provide an antidote to the orgiastic practices of the heretic sects, and to be a remedy for sodomy as well as a means to protect family life.
And we will make rape legal as well. So, you know what? They will get all their anger out onto women. Great start in it. That peculiarly evolves into, no, not only this is all immoral within 200 years, this is all immoral, and also we have to take it against women if their virtue is corrupted. The thing that changed this mindset tends to be considered the Black Death, because when you lose a third of the population of Europe, you lose a third of the population of workers. When women that are prostitutes and have communities because of that have a great understanding of their bodies and how to make it work, because if you work into a mandated by the government brothel, you also have to be careful, not necessarily be pregnant every 9 months. There was all this understanding and knowledge that was passed between women that would basically put one barrier to capitalism, which was the reproduction of the labor force. As you have guessed this far, capitalism doesn't like things that they can't control. So how do we seize the means of reproduction?
The witch hunt destroyed the methods that women had used to control procreation by indicting them as diabolical devices, and institutionalised the state's control over the female body, the precondition for its subordination to the reproduction of labour power. But the witch was not only the midwife, the woman who avoided maternity, or the beggar who eked out a living by stealing some wood or butter from her neighbours. She was also the loose, promiscuous woman, the prostitute or adulteress, and generally the woman who exercised her sexuality outside the bonds of marriage and procreation. Thus, in the witchcraft trials, ill repute was evidence of guilt. The witch was also the rebel woman who talked back, argued, swore, and did not cry under torture. Rebel here refers not necessarily to any specific subversive activity in which women might be involved. Rather, it describes the female personality that had developed, especially among the peasantry, in the course of the struggle against feudal power, when women had been in the forefront of the heretical movements, often organising in female associations, posing a growing challenge to male authority and the church.
Enter the value of the nuclear family. First, you ruin the life and reputation of women that decide to go at it alone, even when they had communes of women. Amazing stories, by the way. No. There is an entire process to make women into legal imbeciles. They cannot take decisions for themselves. It is supported by the church, which writes incredible stuff about the way in which women are animal and absolutely not to be taken seriously, and the only way in which they can exist is under the supervision of a male figure, the husband, the father, a brother, anyone.
Women could not have been totally devalued as workers and deprived of autonomy with respect to men without being subjected to an intense process of social degradation. And indeed, throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, women lost ground in every area of social life. In Germany, when a middle-class woman became a widow, it became customary to appoint a tutor to manage her affairs. German women were also forbidden to live alone or with other women, and, in the case of the poor, even with their own families, since it was expected they would not be properly controlled. Together with the economic and social devaluation, women experienced a process of legal infantilization. English women were discouraged from sitting in front of their homes or staying near their windows. They were also instructed not to spend time with their female friends. In this period, the term gossip, female friend, began to acquire a disparaging connotation.
In this context, at that time, anyone who had a penis won. There is a point that I would like to make, by the way, about women as an identity and women as a social category. We're using the latter here. I'm saying that because as a non-binary person, connecting identity with biology really fucks with my mind and upsets me. But historically, those were the divisions and those were the ways in which people were oppressed. So we're using those terms in that way. So going back to, we try to establish capitalism, the working people really don't like it, this is slavery, what the F? Oh, you know what, to appease the people that the most anger and therefore the most social disruption come from men, young men, we make the brothels. But do you know what? With the brothels, we kind of have the issues of the controlled reproduction because prostitutes don't necessarily want to get that much pregnant. And with the Black Death as well, we have a loss of labor force. So really, we need people to reproduce, whether they like it or not, pretty much. And there's still the frustration of the men. So here's the one tiny bit that so far in my readings is original thought. If it isn't and somebody else has thought about it, please do direct me to the readings, because the moment that this popped up in my mind, brain blown. I am arguing that the nuclear family does, in the microsocial level, what the capitalist system of the elite ruling the workers does on the macrosocial level. The elite needs to threat and oppress the workers in order to force them to sell their labor for a wage that is not nearly enough so that they can extract profit. And that profit goes into their wealth and adds to the capital. The nuclear family puts, in this context, the man on top of the hierarchy, the same way that the elite rules the proletariat. Because when you are that frustrated at being mistreated, at being used, at being tired, and you have been taken away from a community of reference. Remember the enclosures, the fact that there was common land, none of that anymore. Who cares about the community? The important thing is the nuclear family. I genuinely believe that that's the reason why capitalism has moved the attention from the community, the larger village, to the nuclear family, man, woman, child. Exactly because when you remove them from a community of reference, there is not a place that they can go to vent their frustration. There is no way to think that, oh, maybe we need a union here. And when those frustrations go nowhere, offering to these frustrated, overworked men the position of power towards their wife and children allows them to make the very problematic choice of going, the system is abusing me. Is making me really frustrated, is making me really angry. I have no outlet for this anger. But you know what? I have power over someone else the same way that the system has power over me. Am I going to do to the people that are lower than me what the system is doing to me so that I get the frustration out the same way and I continue the cycle? Or am I going to wake up and understand that this cycle is wrong, I need to break the wheel? Am I also going to risk the loss of power towards the few that I have power over? And 9 times out of 10, the answer is we continue the cycle. And so the father of the family, the patriarch, becomes within the nuclear family the one that can control and oppress the class beneath him, which are the women and children. And by the way, this is likely why you see so much resistance, even in the working class, to feminism, because feminism proposes a solution for the people that are oppressed in the family, so the women and the children, without necessarily considering that the man needs to be liberated too from the system of oppression that is capitalism. Otherwise, all that they feel is that they're gonna lose their own victims, the only people that they can exercise power over. And that's, I think, where the resistance to feminism from men that are working class, and they should understand that eventually this will help them, but they are short-sighted in that, and they're like, no, these are the people that I get to command the way that the system commands me. I am not losing my power over them.
I think we have gone through a period when too many children and people have been given to understand, I have a problem, it is the government's job to cope with it, or I have a problem, I will go and get a grant to cope with it. I am homeless, the government must house me. And so they are casting their problems on society, and who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first.
One of the most fascinating things that came back to mind while I was putting this together was realizing that indeed, because capitalism favored and elevated patriarchy because it served capitalism, so capitalism is in a way the highest system, and patriarchy is part of the subsystems that it used to enforce itself. There are also times in which, get ready for this, capitalism is ready to go directly against patriarchy if it needs a scapegoat. I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't just read this article about the United Healthcare CEO situation that happened in December. And this is as far as I can use words without getting shunned by YouTube.
Mr. Mangione's appearance, which he showed off in shirtless social media posts, is now clearly part of the appeal, said cultural critic Blakely Thornton. Americans are effectively programmed to trust and empathize with men who look like Mr. Mangione, he said. That's why they are the protagonists in our movies, books and stories. Public adoration for handsome men accused of crimes is not new.
We are ready to turn against the entire concept that patriarchy upheld white, cis-het, able men when that same system is challenged by the fact a cis-white, het, able man does something against capitalism. Don't worry, Gigi has his problems, but 99 other, and being appreciated, not one of them. Now, let's give a moment of more attention to the reproductive rights and why they became such a subject of contention. Because one could argue, hey, Isha, we're no longer in Black Death times. Do we still need to police the body of women and decide how, when, where, and how many children they have? And thank you so much for asking that. That's why we're going into the cycle of fear. Yes, reproductive rights is how you control the bodies of women and how you guarantee yourself as the capitalist system a continuous pool of workers that are gonna be prepped and primed to become very happy worker ants for you and be grateful if they get a job. Remember, job and wage jobs, when they started to come around, were considered slavery for 200 years. Now we are grateful when we manage to beat the other candidates to get a job. To the point that one of the talking points now is worrying about people coming from abroad and taking our jobs. How easily we forget. Curiously, what I realized reading Caliban and the Witch is that, again, the evolution of things like money and reproductive health is not linear as we are used to think about progress, which is probably why, as I said at the beginning, it feels like we're going backwards now. Apparently, it's something that happened before. Because women were in charge of their bodies and the knowledge of their bodies was shared between communities of women, hence usually midwives, women, they had an understanding not only of their bodies, but of the herbs and effects of that herbs on their bodies. They had centuries to perfect that, and they knew how to work with those bodies, amongst other things, with abortifacients. Before there was the rollback on the recognition of women as individuals, not only the rights, but the recognition as individuals, and the way in which we evolved to make them legal imbeciles. At the same time, once the witch hunts were done, and basically we burned actually not burned, we hanged them, but conceptually, it's an historical wrong, but we have this perception that witches were burned. Mostly they were hanged. But without getting facetious about words, the witch hunts, according to Silvia Federici, and I agree with that, were a way to instill fear and control women. You go off the path, this is what happens to you. And because they riled up people with fear, with the fear of God, because again, religion helps in these things to be oppressive. When things happen and you can find a scapegoat, it's very easy to create a witch hunt, which interestingly is something that Dr. Tabitha Stanholm mentioned in her lecture about feminism and witchcraft, mentioning that it's worth being aware of this because in times where you have, pandemics, economic recessions, the life of people gets worse and worse. People start looking for scapegoats to give the fault to, and it's very, very easy to create witch hunts from that. Sounds familiar? So considering the witch hunts as the ultimate way that capitalism had to instill fear in women and in the population, making the population ready to turn in these women because they were witches, in the perception of what was told them, giving them a scapegoat and making the community turn against them. That kind of communal education about fearing witches not only tried to teach a lesson to women, but taught a lesson to the entire population. You stray, this is what happens to you.
The witch hunt was the first persecution in Europe that made use of a multimedia propaganda to generate a mass psychosis among the population. Alerting the public to the dangers posed by the witches, through pamphlets publicizing the most famous trials and the details of their atrocious deeds, was one of the first tasks of the printing press. Witch hunting in Europe was an attack on women's resistance to the spread of capitalist relations and the power that women had gained by virtue of their sexuality, their control over reproduction, and their ability to heal. Witch hunting was also instrumental to the construction of a new patriarchal order where women's bodies, their labor, their sexual and reproductive powers were placed under the control of the state and transformed into economic resources. This means that the witch hunters were less interested in the punishment of any specific transgressions than in the elimination of generalized forms of female behavior, which they no longer tolerated and had to be made abominable in the eyes of the population.
There's also this perception that the witch hunts was just for women, and admittedly it was the majority, but you stray too much, you're a man, you're a dog apparently, a dog was burned as a witch, you're anything that strays, and people want a scapegoat, I will get rid of you. And I will have the legitimization of doing that because I have convinced the populace to follow me. When we get to the end of the witch hunts in the late 1700s, suddenly, interestingly, other than having a revival of the occult and magic in the 1800s because it was the way that we had to oppose Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, that's another video though, that's why we have the Romantics and Art Nouveau though. And Spiritism, what also starts to get very heavily legislated, and it wasn't before, especially in America. Abortion. Whereas, as I mentioned before, in Europe especially, there was this community of women that knew how to work midwifery and herbalism, basically, for their own interest and needs. that started to be broken down by the witch hunts, because there was this idea that witches sacrificed babies, ate babies, infanticide. We went after that because no, we needed babies because we needed the next generation, because the Black Death had killed so many people that the people that remained could ask for higher wages. What's this nonsense?
For a broad section of the Western European peasantry, and for urban workers, the 15th century was a period of unprecedented power. Not only did the scarcity of labour give them the upper hand, but the spectacle of employers competing for their services strengthened their sense of self-value and erased centuries of degradation and subservience. The scandal of the high wages the workers demanded was only matched in the eyes of their employers by the new arrogance they displayed, their refusal to work or to continue to work after having satisfied their needs, which they now could do more quickly because of their higher wages. Their stubborn determination to hire themselves out only for limited tasks, rather than for prolonged periods of time. Their demands for other perks besides their wages, and their ostentatious clothing, which, according to the complaints of contemporary social critics, made them indistinguishable from the lords. Servants are now masters, and masters are servants.
Impossible. No. We need to make sure that women pop out babies so that the population grows and we don't have to pay these extortionate wages anymore. Laborers with power of coin? How dare you? So that's why we started to make abortion and everything that had to do with infanticide completely illegal, fault of women. No, you do not dare touch in the next generation of labor that I will need. In the US, it took a moment longer, but in the early 1800s, and it's literally something that is part of the history of abortion, in the Roe v. Wade Wikipedia page, starts to be regulated against any and all forms of female reproductive rights. And it gets so strict that, you guessed it, in the 1900s, there's a lot of back alleys abortions where women die. Basically, things need to go societally wrong enough that we see the negative effects of it. And then we start doing things to put a patch on those negative effects. Too many women died and doctors were held responsible for it, male doctors. Maybe we need to make abortions available and safer so that, women don't die, but most importantly, because they don't die, doctors are not accused of manslaughter. Which I think is the reason why now it's been 50 years since Roe v. Wade. Abortions have been available and safe for 50 years. People forget the consequences of that. And so it's easier to start new talking points against abortion because we have forgotten. We haven't seen firsthand the negative consequences of making abortions illegal. And ironically, this silent pact of inaction of let's not do things because if there are negative consequences, they come back to us, is the silent agreement between the right and the left in pretty much every modern country. You know the upset that everybody has, me included, about the Democrats had 50 fucking years to put Roe v. Wade into legislation. Why didn't they do that? And the answer is because at every election cycle, they needed the threat, the fear to present to their voters saying, see, you need to vote for us because if you vote for the other side, they will take this away from you. Basically, you can have a platform and run on a platform that makes promises of very hard things like abortion, immigration, mass deportation. All the LGBTQ people are basically groomers, recognized in law by that. But those are promises that are based in hate or fear. And realistically, hate comes from fear. So that's why this is the cycle of fear, really. All these promises exist because you have fomented this fear and promised a solution to go with it. And that solution comes with a scapegoat. But the important thing is that if you get in power, you do not actually enact that promise. Why? Which is basically the reason why we think that all politicians are the same. They make promises they don't keep. Yeah, there's a reason for that. If you get into office and maintain your promise, then you've done what people wanted. You have nothing else to dangle in front of their faces to be elected the next time. Or worse, you enact what they said they want, what they voted you in for, but there are negative consequences to that they didn't see coming, and they will take it against you for it. And as a result of that, you lose the argument and you lose power. A very interesting example of that works for the UK and the US is the scapegoat of immigrants. Oh, immigration, they come and steal our jobs, they take our welfare, they bring criminality, they are lazy. All the bad possible things is because people were born on the wrong side of an imaginary line that we call a border. That's all you need to know. And you are lucky because your birth lottery made you be born on the right side of the right border. It's a line that does not exist, but it's fine. You just have to believe that because basically I'm also telling you, you're one of the good ones. So you will take whoever I tell you that it's one of the bad ones because it's not you. And let's not forget that capitalism needs slavery, as we mentioned before. So when here in the UK we had the battle for Brexit and thought that, the people from especially East Europe come here, lower the prices, how dare them, let's close our borders, and terrible things. We do that and suddenly, as if they didn't see it coming, all the people that were coming from Europe filling jobs of every kind, from picking up vegetables to be doctors, because let's be completely fair, doctors that are educated in mainland Europe are better educated than the ones formed in the UK, and one wonders why we have an NHS crisis now. But yeah, that's the thing. All those immigrants were here doing jobs either better than the UK was prepared to do, or for less than the UK was prepared to do. Take away the immigrants, and that's why we have been in an economic slump since the pandemic. The pandemic now has been over, but not our economic slum. I wonder why. Another interesting point about immigration that nobody makes a talking point for is that because Western countries have lowering birth rates, you do need the immigrants to make up for that loss. Because you know what? We are supposedly evolved enough that, fingers crossed, our reproductive rights here in the UK are okay-ish, in a direction at least. So we are not forced to have babies yet, basically, like in the US. And that means that the birth rates are going down, which will mean less workers for the next generations. Those workers still need to come from somewhere, especially with an aging population that will need carers, that will need doctors. And that is what immigration does. The most amazing thing is that the attempt to actually crack down on immigration because they thought that the right wing really wanted that is something that has been tried out in Florida by Ron DeSantis. And how did that turn out? The scapegoatism of illegal immigrants in Florida and let's do mass deportation was one of those weird things in which the right went off script. There's this silent agreement of, yes, we make promises, but really on the heavy things, we don't take action because of the reasons that we saw before. A, I still need you to vote me on the next election cycle with a promise. And B, I cannot risk the negative consequences, really. And Ron DeSantis risked the negative consequences, and we immediately saw what they were. The entire economy of Florida was based on the work of illegal workers. You take those away, and suddenly all the people that voted you in on the right that declared to hate immigrants and illegal workers suddenly come at you saying, what the fuck have you done with my economy? Everything was running fine, and now it's not. Why? And does it need an explanation? So, why? Why was this implicit promise of not actually taking extreme action on the right or on the left was broken and was broken by the right? My theory is that the right, on the long term, was losing the argument. What does that mean? Other than the fact that there was a lot of progressiveness and rights given to all the minorities, diversity, equity, inclusion, women's rights, LGBT rights, change to marriage law, disability rights, immigration rights. I mentioned it before in one of my videos. The more you belong to a marginalized community or identity, the more likely you are to vote progressive because you do understand, or you should, that that's how you got rights. So the standard person that votes conservative tendentially comes from privilege. So it's white, cis, able, wealthy, and usually male. When you are white, cis, able, wealthy woman, we go into white feminism, or we see the effects in Thatcher, in Liz Truss, in Theresa May, in Giorgia Meloni, in all those white women that got into power on the right side, thinking that they need to be worse than the men to take a seat at the boys' club. We will make one day a video about that. If you want more specific information about that, I made a video essay on another channel called Right-Wing Women and Why Liz Truss Got in Power. You can go check that out. It basically talks about internalized misogyny and why white women of a certain privilege think on the short term that it's better for them to serve patriarchy and capitalism that unite to destroy it. Short-sighted, but you know. But the important point here about the loss of the argument was actually the loss of voters. You know that there's that saying about, oh, don't worry, when you get older, your mindset will change, you'll start voting on the right. That has always been true until millennials. Why? Because with the kind of economy that there was before, even if it was capitalist, there were fail-safes like Keynesian economics, we talked about it in Capitalism and Cottagecore, which basically still made it decent and affordable for people that were waged to still have a decent life and create the infamous middle class. Yeah, there is no middle class in millennial generation.
If you are not a liberal at 25, you have no heart. If you are not a conservative at 35, you have no brain. So said Winston Churchill, or US President John Adams, or perhaps King Oscar II of Sweden. Variations of this aphorism have circulated since the 18th century, underscoring the well-established rule that as people grow older, they tend to become more conservative. Millennials, born between 1981 and 1996, started out on the same trajectory, but then something changed. The shift has striking implications for the UK's Conservatives and US Republicans, who can no longer simply rely on their base being replenished as the years pass.
Because neoliberalism broke every rule and just made the richer richer and took away rights and money from the people that work for a living, we got to a point where millennials who were born in the 80s and 90s do not have capital to protect anymore. Because millennials were born in the 80s and 90s at a time where neoliberalism had taken away all the safeguarding that made it possible for people to accumulate any kind of wealth and made it into the middle class. No, we are just working class. We have no capital to protect, and we do understand that it's capitalism that did that to us. So we're getting older, but we're not starting to vote for the right. And so the right decided to take matters into their own hands, because if they don't decimate the amount of people that vote against them, which now includes older people like elder millennials, well, they're not gonna get in power anymore, which is why voter suppression is at an all-time high. Because it's hard to keep getting in power when you just look after the interest of a very small amount of people, white, cis-het, able, rich men. Let's go a bit more in detail into this war on minorities, because for what I just said, you might have got a flavor as to why, minorities kind of have a vested interest in not voting conservative. But there is a very specific point that I would like to make about LGBT rights, especially the way that we are going insane, both in the UK and the US, about trans people, despite trans people being such a minuscule amount of the population that, believe you me, they are not threatening anything or anyone. But we need to make this scaremongering huge for such a negligible amount of people. The issue is twofold, dichotomous. One, LGBT people in general and trans people specifically are the ultimate threat to the nuclear family. When you can jump on either side of the line of the spectrum of gender, what the actual F? One of the main issues that actually right-wing women had with LGBT people, which in the 80s they just had the perception was men, was actually that if gay men became too attractive to their husbands, they will lose their right that they get when they become wives and mothers. Within the frame of male domination, there is good reason for women to adhere to conservative or right-wing. Within the frame of male domination, there is good reason for women to hate homosexuality, both male and female. Homosexuality, its rise in public visibility, attempts to socially legitimize or protect it, a sense that it is attractive and on the move and winning not only acceptance but practitioners, makes women expendable. The one thing women can do and be valued for will no longer be valued, cannot be counted on to be that bedrock of women's worth. This is true both of lesbianism and male homosexuality, in that both negate women's reproductive value to men. But male homosexuality is especially terrifying because it suggests a world without women altogether, a world in which women are extinct. The perception that having children is the only edge women have on survival at the hands of men is right. It is an acute perception grounded in an accurate reading of what women are for and how women are used by men in this sexual system. Without reproduction, women as a class have nothing. In sorrow or not, bearing babies is what women can do that men need, really need. No handjob can substitute here. And homosexuality makes women afraid, irrationally, passionately afraid of extinction, of being unnecessary as a class, as women, to men who destroy whatever they do not need and whose impulses toward women are murderous anyway. So actually, that's a very interesting thing to see about that infamous internalized misogyny and trying to scrabble for scraps at the table of the patriarchal capitalism. The fact that LGBT people in general and trans people in particular raise the biggest middle finger to anything that is expected about femininity and masculinity literally breaks down the very binary division that there is at the foundation of the nuclear family of man, woman that makes children, woman that is under the man, which would make it interesting to talk about kink, but we're not going to go there now. But also might be interesting why the ultra-conservative people in America have trans porn as one of the highest searches. But as I said before, the nuclear family, woman, man, children, is the micro-social representation of the system of capitalism. If you dare thinking of a nuclear family that might consider the two adults on an equal level, that starts to break down the mirroring. And if that breaks down the mirroring of the higher system of capitalism, the workers might start to realize that maybe the system is not right either. If you don't just have two people in the nuclear family, but you start to have triples, polycules, all these things that are considered queer. Queer is the antithesis of the very rigid rules that capitalism needs to perpetrate and continue itself. The nuclear family needs to produce and reproduce the next generation of laborers, make them grateful to get a job, not let them raise their own heads, prepping and priming them to be slaves. Anyone that gets out of these boundaries and tries to think maybe things should be different is someone dangerous whose ideas need to stop with them. If the next generation is raised even in queer families, they will be taught progressively and they will not bend their head, let alone ever vote for the right. And by all means, queer families, thank goodness, have now enough rights to have their own children, to adopt their own children, unless you're in Italy and you're literally taken off the birth certificate of your child if you are in a same-sex couple. But that's literally part of what the rollback of rights for queer people as well as women is trying to do. If I make it harder and harder for you to be queer, if I make you choose as a lesbian woman to either have a child within a nuclear family or not be allowed to have children, to have IVF, to adopt if you are in a queer relationship, what do you think is going to happen? Well, I can tell you what they hope is going to happen, that you will choose children. The infamous story that they tell themselves that we are making lifestyle choices and it's not who we are intrinsically, it's therefore something that we can be forced to choose in a different direction. And despite the fact that I am child-free and I do not understand it, I do understand that a lot of people have a biological imperative to, I don't even understand, is it passing on the genes? Is it passing on culture? I am sure that there are good people that have children, but what I mean to say is that I am actually pretty positive that queer families and families outside of the mirroring of capitalism within the nuclear family can create an environment where children grow up to be adult in a much more aware and decent and with a solidarity mindset. But if rights are rolled back for you to even be able to have or adopt children as a queer person, all these things are trying to push us further and further towards, again, the nuclear family, where it doesn't matter if you're lesbian or gay or non-binary or queer or bi. Bi people are just selfish, they want never to choose. That's what they used to say, isn't it? Just because I would very happily be thrown on Carlax's shoulder or under a starion. Like, no, I just have great taste across the spectrum. If the rollback of rights force you to choose between your identity or your future through children, yeah, the hope of the right is that you will go for children because biology and because they need it. And don't worry, even if you decide to be in a queer relationship and not have children, they will still make life hard enough for you, where eventually what they want to push you towards is the nuclear family, because that's all they need from you. And they will use religion, they will use anything that serves their purpose to get there. Which is why I firmly believe that the people at the head of the Heritage Foundation are not Christian. They don't give a fuck about Christianity or any values, but they know that they can instrumentalize it to go where they need to go, where they want to go. Where? To keep capital safe. How? Through the nuclear family. And nobody that strays from that, because that is the fundamental unit upon which capitalism is based upon. Let's talk about some conclusions here, because it's getting late and it's still Sunday. And you know, brain sparks tire you. They definitely tire me. The main thing is that in this context, I feel like I sort of answered my own question in the video about the election, about understanding how can people abstain from voting. Well, when the system is set up in this way, and in such a way where you know that no matter if the right or the left, the point is that they all make promises that they know they cannot maintain, exactly because they need to still keep the cycle of fear on your head to threaten you at the next election. How can you be involved in a wheel that needs breaking? I kind of get it. I definitely understand the emotion. The fact that there were 50 years, again, to enshrine Roe v. Wade into law, and the Democrats decide not to do it because they needed the threat to keep people voting them, it's unacceptable. This is the part in which I also remind you, being a Witchcraft channel, that Pluto is in Aquarius, so thinking of revolution, not that out of the realm of possibilities. Hey Gigi. I have particular sympathy for every person with half a brain cell that is stuck in the US, because I realized, looking into Roe v. Wade, that after the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, everybody voted in Supreme Court is voted there and they stay there for life. So if there is pressure that can be done on them before they are voted in, once they're there, they do whatever the fuck they want. And most of the people on the Supreme Court are now constitutional fundamentalists, which genuinely believe that the Constitution done in the 1700s should be interpreted as people in the 1700s wrote it, which I seem to understand is the reason why the Supreme Court couldn't mandate for COVID masks, because in the 1700s we didn't have an understanding about airborne sicknesses, and so people in the 1700s that wrote the Constitution would not have mandated for masks. You are hostages of a country that lives 300 years ago, or wants you to live in the world of 300 years ago, which, guess what, was governed by white, cis, het, able, rich men, and there was still slavery. It's the most powerful country in the world with an 18th century mentality. It's the equivalent of being a boy, mom, toddler with a gun, told that he can do no wrong, holding everybody else hostage. I don't think it's by chance that this is the context that created a person like Elon Musk, which is now talking about liberating the UK and is allegedly collaborating with Dominic Cummings, who I do not hesitate calling pretty much a sociopath from the consequences of the things that he did to this country. And now he's being hired, allegedly, to smear Keir Starmer, who is the only, I think, effectively Western leader at the moment that is slightly on the left of center, and that is already too left for the billionaires that hold the capital as the only important thing, and Musk is the prime example of that. Not that here in the UK we have anything to be particularly glad about, because despite the fact that we voted in Labour in July of 2024, Labour has not shown so far to be any better than the Tories. The Tories, before leaving office, put into law that puberty blockers could not be accessed by trans people. They're still valid for cis children, but if you want to access it because you have gender dysphoria, you are a trans person, no, you can't. The Tories did that just before leaving office because they knew that they would have paid no consequences and they would have lost the election anyway. So they did one of those infamous actions that we were talking about that are supposed to never be done because you need the threat, you need the fear. They did it because they had nothing to lose. Labour decided to enshrine that in law. The Tories did it, and Labour decided to maintain it. So we're not that better off, don't worry about that. But the fact that Musk has decided that now he needs to make sure that we lean more towards the right, on top of it, a toddler with a gun. And my point is, are you mad yet? Because if you're not, I feel like you should watch this again. Or you know, the other ones that I have done, or the other videos that I've linked in the description below, because there is a lot to be mad about here. There is a lot of manipulation that is being done just at the end of the day to extract labor power from you, because it's the only value that exists, and they just decided it needs not to be yours. You need to not belong to yourself. And they wonder why I say that witchcraft is the opposite of capitalism. Organize, plan, and above all, please, if one thing stays with you from this video is that, along with witchcraft, the opposite of capitalism is community. Find your community, organize within your community, support your community. We cannot claim common land, but that's where we should be headed towards. We are not going to win with a nuclear family of 3. That's exactly why they want to keep us there and isolated. Community is how we beat these. If the Heritage Foundation can gather along all the people that have no actual interest or principle behind them just to make and save more money, we have a lot more valid and more noble and more moral reasons to gather together. And until the next video, do I need saying that we need to fight the capitalist patriarchy together and hex it because there's a lot of need for it? Of all the ways that one wakes up on Sunday morning.
Oh God, it's fucking Sunday?
It is.